Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. So, my buddy GamerRay recently put out a video regarding Nier Automata and how the meaning we generate from it as players stems directly from our relationship with other games. It's really great and I'll link it in the description, but it also got me thinking about how this notion of context isn't solely limited to how we interact with a game. It's a whole bunch of factors, both personal and external. The state of the industry at the time, its proximity to other games, etc. As such, we may have a pretty good idea of what we think a game represents at the time of its release, but as time goes on, can that meaning change? Could we reach a point in time where the context of play has shifted so much that even the games we view as masterpieces now are rendered meaningless? Let me back up a bit. I mainly started thinking about this in light of the recent re-release of Vanquish on PC, because even in the mere 7 years since its initial release, the meaning I derive from that game has shifted almost entirely. Vanquish is a game that fans were clamouring for after Bayonetta was stealth launched on Steam back in April, and less than a month later they got it and the internet was awash with gushing retrospectives about how this is the port of the beloved classic you've been waiting for, which all seemed a little odd to me for a game that at the time largely came and went. Obviously it had its cult following and reviewed pretty well for the most part, but it was a really short game with no multiplayer mode and a terrible story to boot, and so either people moved on quick or they didn't make the steep investment to begin with. And don't get me wrong here, that infuriated me at the time because I was one of those cult followers all those years ago, watching people pass up this wild experience that I felt was really sticking it to the industry as a whole. And now I installed it the other night, beat it that same night, came away thinking it was still pretty damn good, but nowhere near as revolutionary. And it really did feel revolutionary at the time. Consider the gaming landscape of 2010. Gears of War had seen major success a few years before, and by this point, everyone was wanting a piece of that cover shooter pie. It felt like every game that came out featured some daft hunk of meat, slowly staggering around the drab battlefield, going from conveniently placed chest-high wall to conveniently placed chest-high wall, taking potshots at other conveniently placed chest-high walls. I feel like I heard calls for the abstract notion of innovation coming up a lot around that time. Then you've got Vanquish, jet sliding and carving its way through the competition at blistering speeds. Cover was there, but you'd often feel like a chump if you stayed in it for too long, because think of all the dope stuff you could be doing out there. It really was all about speed and forward momentum in a landscape that felt so plodding and methodical, which made it feel important on both a mechanical and industry level. I think in terms of personal context, however, it was important to me because it was one of the first games I remember playing where I didn't look at the events in the cutscenes and think, man, I wish I could do that in game. The cutscenes featured a lot of talking, something the gameplay stood in firm opposition towards. Flying over cover into slow-mo to take out multiple enemies before blazing across the battlefield to the one enemy left and fly-kicking them into oblivion. It felt weird having that level of control over how events played out, considering how constrictive many mainstream games felt at the time. That wasn't just limited to shooters either, that was action games in general. It always felt like the flashiness of cutscenes gave way to something that just didn't feel as fluid or spectacular, and it felt like Vanquish was a game that you could show people and say, it doesn't have to be like that, we can do better. Now though, that context has changed significantly. I mean, it's 7 years later, we're no longer subject to a barrage of mediocre cover shooters, partially because success wears off, and also because there are just a whole lot more games for us to play now. Consoles aren't the dominant force they arguably still were around the time of Vanquish's release. We've moved past the time where a multiplayer component was seen as a necessity to maintain longevity of a game. In fact, with multiplayer-only games like Rainbow Six Siege scoring lower for a perceived lack of content, and games like Hitman encouraging replayability of single-player levels, we've almost moved in the opposite direction. Hell, even the speed of movement Vanquish prided itself on has been aped by some of the biggest shooters in the business. And you know what? With that, Vanquish is no longer the unique oddity, the curio melding shooter and action like no other game that it perhaps once was. But it's still really good, it's just that now I see it as more of a popcorn game than anything else. The equivalent of sticking on a dumb action movie for an evening, right down to the gravel voiced protagonists, and the story that results in your character essentially saying, "The world is gubbed, but at least I did okay." It's all total fluff. Ideas like directing your own fun become a little muted when you consider just how many options we have for that nowadays, and just how linear Vanquish actually is. Now we have a better grasp over what mechanics can convey thematically, the idea of having slower sections doesn't add necessary contrast to proceedings as much as it brings them to a jarring halt. I'm looking at you, monorail section. The game already has a means of granting much needed respite from the chaos around us. It's the slow-mo mechanic. It momentarily gives you slightly more control than you would have normally, which in a game so short is all you really need to give the action peaks and troughs. That said, there's also the fact that there have been so many super long games coming out of late that it's kind of refreshing to have a game that I'm able to just stick on and beat in the same night without having to think too much about it. Instead of this intense experience that seemed angrily focused on dragging games away from the generic mire we found ourselves in 2010, Vanquish now comes across, to me anyway, as a distinctly video game-esque throwback. A distraction from and response to games seen in recent years which served to move the medium forward. And that's fine, there's a place for that. It's just interesting to me how differing contexts have almost reversed the meaning of an experience that itself has remained largely unchanged. And this is just an example of a game's meaning shifting through mechanics too. What about those games whose themes are defined by the context under which they released? Take something like Spec Ops The Line for instance, which celebrates its 5th birthday this year, holy moly. That game served as a polemic against the kind of jingoistic assembly line shooters coming out annually. It forced us to examine the views of violence and American imperialism that these games desensitized us to, precisely by presenting itself as one of those shooters. However, Call of Duty arguably doesn't hold the authority it once did. Again, we have so much choice in what we play nowadays that it's hard to imagine these shooters really as a going concern. Even AAA games, however successful they may or may not be in this endeavour, are more eager than ever to engage with political issues. Games like Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty WW2 have returned their respective series to their roots, but always with the caveat that we're going to treat it with respect this time. People are far more likely to notice and comment on it when a war shooter is trivializing war. More than merely representing the horrors of conflict, Spec Ops is a video game about a specific era of video games about conflict. The game is all about holding the player accountable for their complicity in the proliferation of this type of flippantly violent shooter. If this decline in popularity of these shooters continues, then is there a point at which it stops being meaningful outside of, hey, I guess look at how bad military shooters used to be at this stuff? I mean, is there value in trying to maintain that level of meaning the game had when we initially played it, when it made us feel utterly awful for treating violence as flippantly as we did? Ultimately, I'm not really sure, but as is the case with most subjects of this nature, it's less about finding concrete answers than it is about examining the questions we ask. Video game preservation is something that has long fascinated me, and the fact that it seems to be coming into more prominence with organisations like the Video Game History Foundation and the growing popularity of emulators is immensely pleasing to me. It's just interesting that we've progressed as a medium to the point that preservation is no longer merely a matter of technology, but importantly, and in a lot of ways excitingly, a matter of meaning and context. So I hope you enjoyed this slightly different piece from what I normally do on context in games. If you did, why not hit the subscribe button as well as the little bell thingy, share it with a friend, and check out the podcast in the description. If you want to go the extra mile, however, and get some goodies in the process, you can always support my Patreon like these lovely individuals currently on screen. Your continued support helps me more than you can possibly know in terms of keeping the show going. For that, I cannot thank each and every one of you enough. Special thanks go to Iego Foxo Booza, Justin's Holderness, James Doring, Biggie Smith, Mark B. Writing, Peter, Artyom Vitsyuk, Christian Kuhneman, Nico Blakely, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.